Then, welcome all of you for this discussion of Huckfield's How Blair Killed the Co-ops, and we'll be here for about an hour and a half. I'm going to briefly introduce Les, then John McDonnell is going to talk for about 10 minutes, then Les is going to talk about his book for half an hour, and that should leave us with about 45 minutes for discussion. During that, if you've got a question, you have to raise the virtual hand, so to speak, rather than do it in the chat. If you don't want to be recorded, given that we are recording, and you still want to ask a question, obviously switch your camera off. By now, I probably shouldn't have to tell people to mute when they're not asking a question, but obviously do mute if you're not asking a question. Without any further ado, Les Huckfield is a former baby of the House in the Houses of Parliament when elected as an MP in Nuneaton in the late 60s. He was later a founding member of the Socialist Campaign Group and was particularly involved with devising policy for cooperatives for the 1983 manifesto, later in the Greater London Council, on transport as well with the Greater London Council, and was later kind of reprises this role in the kind of 4.5 years in which the left has some sort of control over the leadership of the Labour Party. In which capacity he was charged by John McDonnell with coming up with a plan that would double the number of co-ops in Britain. And he was, as he notes in the book, surprised to find while doing this that a lot of people didn't know that the size of the cooperative sector had doubled previously in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. And in many ways, this book is about what happened after that doubling, after actually this quite kind of large cooperative sector and social enterprise sector, and the difference between those two terms is very, very important, had sort of emerged partly out of sort of doing the things the welfare state didn't do, and kind of moved into its gaps. And that later sort of comes to mean something rather different after 1997, and a quite sort of different kind of, that rather than sort of being the things that the welfare state doesn't do, it sort of is increasingly something which is sort of put in charge with being part of a more general privatization and marketization of the welfare state and of social life more generally. So I think that's more or less my 5 minutes of introduction. So John is going to talk for about 10 minutes, and I'm going to try and keep people to the time, knowing that this might not always be that easy. So without further ado, John.
Thanks, Owen. First of all, let me just say a few words about Les, because I feel as though I should embarrass him at this stage anyway. He sent me a PDF of the book, which I've gone through. I really welcome it. I think it's really needed. And as Owen has said, I've known Les for a number of years. We've worked together in numerous political and trade union campaigns. I'll just say this, that there are few on the left, in fact, if any, really, who've got the breadth of experience that he has, both in terms of politics, in terms of parliament, ministerial office, within the movement overall and within Europe, and also actually as quite an extremely good, he'll be embarrassed at this, an extremely good bureaucrat when it comes to writing reports and providing politicians with options to decide, and that's the way that we've worked together. And I've always thought he's combined that intellectual capacity with, well, such a fire in the belly commitment to socialism. And as a result, in every intervention that Les has made over the years, he shakes us up. He shakes up debates. That's his role. And I think around the cooperative sector now, I think we do need a shaking up to talk about its role and the potential of co-ops, and getting back to that discussion about the cooperative movement and how it can transform our economy and society. Just to engage in the politics of the moment for a little while. I actually do think this is a key political moment. The corruption and obvious mendacity of the Johnson regime are opening up vulnerabilities that the Tories may not recover from before the next election. But the problem, and I speak as a Labour MP, the problem for Labour at the moment is that although voters are peeling away from the Tories in disgust, they're not necessarily shifting their vote to Labour, and won't do unless there's something to offer that they're convinced is worth voting for. And that's why I think Labour now urgently does need that vision of society it wants to create, supported by at least the key components of a policy programme that affords the opportunity of achieving that vision. And I still do adhere to the dictum. It may not always dominate political calculation, but actually I do think it is the economy stupid. And so that I think the Labour Party does need to develop an economic strategy that resonates with people whose votes we need to secure. And I actually am convinced, and have been for a while, that an attractive element of Labour's economic offer could be the promotion of cooperative working and alternative models of ownership. And for this reason, really, increasingly in the current labour market, people are looking for greater opportunity, greater control over their working lives, a greater say over their working conditions, their hours of work and their workplace, but also a greater share in the rewards of their work, their operation, their contribution. And many want a sense of ownership. Co-ops can give all these things. It's what they were designed to do. But it's important that we're clear about what we mean by cooperative. And that really is the challenge that Les has set us in the book. He asked me to talk about some of the experience that we've had together largely in the development of cooperative thinking in this country. Les, as has been said, was developing the ideas in the 1980s, part of the development of the alternative economic strategy, and was key in the design of some of the architecture of the 83 manifesto that actually did inform the debates that we then had well into the 80s and 90s. Where I come into it, I suppose, is that actually my role in the GLC, my experience with Les started with the GLC and the development of ideas around cooperative. I was elected in 1981. I became the deputy leader and the chair of finance. And let's be clear, our GLC administration was socialist. It had a straightforward socialist objective of achieving equality through democracy. And that meant shifting wealth and power to working people. Our strategy, and Owen and I have discussed this, was in and against the state. So you secure the power of the state to give that power to the people, effectively to largely empower the powerless. And you secured economic power by economic democracy. And our argument was actually that should be at the level of the firm itself. Some of you, well, you'll all remember the Thatcher government had been elected in '79. It was the early stages of imposing a monetarist policy on the economy, the first real wave of neoliberalism hitting us. And at its core was the ideological commitment to letting the market rip, restraining labour by restricting trade union rights, cutting public expenditure, privatising public services, and reducing the role in all its forms except where it was needed to promote the interests of capital, especially finance capital. And the result in London, when Les and I were working together, was a complete collapse, virtually, in area after area of traditional industries, a massive erosion of London's manufacturing base, and a failure to develop any alternative skilled employment opportunities for working people. Alongside that, we had cuts in spending on public services in the NHS, education, local government, and that increased unemployment, but also had an impact on wages and demand in the economy overall. In the run-up to the GLC election, we drafted a comprehensive manifesto. It set out how we develop an alternative industrial strategy. And as soon as we were elected, we appointed a team under Robin Murray, including people like Hilary Wainwright, Mike Cooley from the Lucas Plan Initiative, to work with trade unions, businesses, local communities, and research bodies to develop a detailed sector-by-sector industrial strategy. And that's what we did. And we set up the Greater London Enterprise Board. And my job in terms of Chair of Finance was to provide the resources to enable them to resource the support to existing and new enterprises. But we specifically worked as a cooperative development agency to promote the co-op model. That meant advocating for the model, but also training people interested in either converting their existing firm or setting up a new enterprise on a cooperative basis. And we provided immense resources, to be frank. I had control of the rates, the business rates, and a huge capital fund, 3 billion. And we provide financial support to secure jobs and develop the co-ops themselves. It meant, actually, the GLC and a large number of other Met councils, you look at what happened in Sheffield and elsewhere, they became seen by the Thatcher regime as a direct challenge to the very ideas and policies of Thatcherite Tory central government. But what we were doing also became immensely popular. And the inevitable result was that Thatcher could never allow Labour councillors who ran the GLC and elsewhere to go back to the polls again. So instead, she abolished the GLC, leaving the capital without its own government for the next 2 decades. Throughout that period, Les was working on the transport campaigns in particular, and we were looking at also local community development models in we called it a community areas plan in every area, making sure that those communities had the resources to empower themselves in all different aspects of life, but particularly with regard to the economy, the development of trade union rights, and the establishment of widespread range of co-ops. After I had a slight contretemps with Ken Livingstone over rate capping and the GLC was abolished, I reverted to being a civil servant, and I became secretary or chief executive of the Association of London Authorities, that represented the London Labour boroughs, that eventually evolved in the Association of London Government, represent all the London boroughs of the City of London. And as the chief exec of the ALA, then the ALG, it was ironic, one of my roles was managing the disaggregation of many of the GLC functions to the boroughs. But in doing so, I was able to preserve the Greater London Enterprise Board with the financial support of the Labour boroughs. And it continued to do, with much limited resources, it continued to do significant work in London, both in terms of developing alternative economic models, promoting in particular the development of skills training, and eventually we were able to secure quite significant sums of European funding that I managed for London overall, and provided GLE with at least a base from which to continue on. That was the GLC period. Tough though it was, I found at the time being part of it, but also talking to others since it, being quite inspirational about envisioning for people that there was an alternative way in which at each level of the economy could be managed by workers themselves. The next opportunity I had to promote the co-op agenda was when Jeremy Corbyn appointed me as Shadow Chancellor, and I worked alongside Rebecca Long-Bailey in developing the policy programme for our 2017 and 2019 manifestos. And it was about essentially promoting alternative models of ownership. Central to those manifestos was to secure a transformation of our economy by means of a radical promotion of economic democracy. And that includes policies like the inclusive ownership scheme, the transfer of 10% of a company's shares into the joint hands of workers themselves, worker democracy, workers taking up a third of every board. But in addition to that, we set up a whole range of advisory groups. I can see lots of names that participate in those groups on the screen. And they comprised a huge range of policy experts, trade union representatives, business leaders as well. But as part of that, we set up the co-op advisory group that Les was the key member. And that was charged, as Owen said, with drafting the plan to at least double the cooperative sector within our economy. Actually, when we looked at the doubling exercise, as Les and others will tell you, we felt that was relatively conservative and that we could have go much further once we got into power. Some of you may remember in 2017, we convened a conference and published a report, Alternative Models of Ownership. The report, for me, I found it a comprehensive explanation of what we were planning when we went into government, and it included cooperative ownership at its core, municipal and locally led ownership, and then national ownership. Let me just quote very briefly from the report, because Owen is a severe chair and he'll pull me up if I go on too long. This is what it said about cooperative ownership. It said cooperative ownership has the ability to increase employment stability and increase productivity levels, as well as making firms more democratic. To support the expansion of cooperatives, it's necessary to improve their access to finance, and examples from Italy and Spain point in the direction necessary to achieve this. And we said cooperatives can further be supported by national legislation and a reworked government procurement policy. Built into that work was the development of regional cooperative development agencies again, but fully resourced to enable co-ops to be, first of all, nurtured, developed, and then harnessed for the community good. Unfortunately, the election of December 2019 put an implementation of these ideas on hold, except that we were strong supporters of community wealth building, and the work Matthew Brown had undertaken in developing the Preston model and linking up with the US Democracy Collaborative was one of the key aspects of the work that we did. What we've seen now is the development of the cooperative model is integral to that community wealth building and is being taken up by a wide range of Labour local authorities. So just to conclude then, having gone through the 70s, 80s and on to today, I take the view that you can't keep a good idea down. Progressive political surges come in waves. And despite the electoral defeat in 2019, the ideas, and I think a great deal of the idealism taken forward by the last progressive wave, are still with us. And I think they're ready for the next wave surge. And I think those of us that aim to ensure that cooperation is at the heart of the next wave, and when we discuss the economic planning for the next Labour government, I think what we have to do is to create a climate of intellectual ferment and debate and discussion that ensures this idea can't be ignored by any political party that not just wants to be elected, but actually is serious about wanting to change and transform our economy and our society. That's where Les's book comes in. I think it puts us back on the path of what real cooperation is all about, and what the principles upon which learning the lessons of what happened, yes, under New Labour and others, learning the principles of that to lay the foundations for that discussion that takes place for when we have the next progressive government. Thanks, Owen. I think I've just about kept to time. What we have now then is Les, I think, Owen.
Yeah, the floor's yours.
Kim, is that okay? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, good, Les.
Right, okay. I have to keep asking because Kim is doing all the technical stuff. A couple or three introductory things. First of all, I've got quite a lot of PowerPoint slides to present to you tonight, but those of you who've seen my PowerPoints before will know that I don't speak to every slide, so you'll be okay. There is a bibliography at the end in case you want to check up on where I got it from. And of course, I'll put the PowerPoint on my site, huckfield.com, at the end. So if you're still confused or can't stand the pace, then that's where you'll find it. Let me just say a word of thanks, by the way, to Scott, and that's the Social Entrepreneurs Network Scotland, Social Enterprise Network Scotland, rather. Scott sticks to the rules. We still believe in social enterprises as they ought to be, and that's why I'm very, very pleased that Scott is doing the hosting tonight. My thanks to Pauline, who heads up Scott, but particularly to Kim, who's done a lot of background work to get the show on the road, to Sarah, who unfortunately is still with us but is coming down rapidly with a cold, and also to Mary, and in the background Georgie. So I really am very grateful indeed to Scott for doing the technical backup and for making this possible. I also want to thank the team at Manchester University Press. That's Becca, Chris, Jen, Lucy, and Lucy, by the way, chose the cover of the book, and also Rob, and before her there was Jonathan DePayer, but that's the book, and Lucy chose the cover. So my thanks indeed to the Manchester University Press team. I also want to give some very sincere thanks, though, to Matt Thompson, who was then at the University of Liverpool, is now at UCL, and also to Alan Southern. But Matt kindly gave me a lot of guidance on what bringing out a book is all about. So in many ways, it was down to Matt and to Alan as my original external examiner of my thesis. That's where a lot of this comes from as well. Tiny bit more background. This really started when I did a presentation at a conference in Liverpool back in 2016, and Bertrand Tate from the University of Manchester said to me, Les, you could turn that into a book. Well, okay, it took us 5 years to go, but that's where it all started from Bertrand's suggestion back in 2016. And as I say, it took quite some time. I want to also, apart from all of the people, by the way, that I've given very, very grateful thanks to in the opening of the book, and I really have had to thank a lot of people in the opening of the book because they've been very, very helpful indeed. But apart from them, I was dead chuffed tonight to see Jenny Boswell-Jones and Ismail Saray signed up, because quite honestly, without Jenny and Ismail, I turned up in the middle of July 2015 trying to find out who was still around from the key social enterprise London period. And they both said, well, why don't you go and see so-and-so? And Ismail said, well, actually, we've got some of that on video as well. So I have to say that without Jenny and Ismail, a lot of this would not have been possible at all. And all the signposting and the information that they gave to me. Also, my very sincere thanks to a good friend of mine, John Goodman in Coventry, with whom I worked extensively when I was in the West Midlands. John used to be the political advisor to what then became Co-ops UK. So again, to John, very, very grateful indeed for all of the information and the help that he's given me. As I say, there's a lot more people that I thank in the front of the book, but I just wanted to say thank you particularly to Jenny and Ismail and to John for all of the help that they gave me. Just a word or two about John and Owen. I obviously go back a long way with John, and I'm very pleased to be a friend of John's. And I think, as you will see from what he said, I hope the feeling's still mutual, John. But John and I go back to our days in the GLC, because in between my time in the House of Commons and the European Parliament, I actually worked for the Greater London Council, running one of Ken Livingstone's and John's external campaigns. I have to say that that was genuinely one of the most exciting political times of my life. And that's why I was very grateful to John for being able to rehearse once again some of the alternative local social economy stuff that I've been advocating in the book, because that's what the GLC was doing at that time. But the other reason that I want to say that I'm very grateful to Owen is that Owen has written extensively about that period. So to be frank with you, I couldn't wish for a better team to be helping the discussion tonight than John and Owen. John goes back to that period in the GLC with the proposals that I've just described. Owen is very knowledgeable and frequents that period with his writing. So very, very grateful indeed to both of you. Let me get straight away into the presentation. And Kim, you're going to have to tell me if this is okay, because this is where we have to do the great daring screen share. If you can hold on just one tiny minute.
Should be good, Liz.
Is that looking okay?
Perfect.
Right, okay. I usually say to my students, can you see me? Okay, right. That's the cover of the, this is going to get round to the cover of the book. I think you've either seen that in various flyers, but you'll hopefully be able to see it a bit more realistically when we get round to it later. A very, very brief background, and if I may say so, without trying to boast, because that's not my style. I'd like to think that the sort of brief rehearsal of the things that I've been involved in and around the cooperative movement for the last, well, it's almost 60 years now, that ought to give me, if I may say so, some kind of legitimacy to be able to write and to be able to talk about the things in the book. I was first elected to the House of Commons in 1967, just in time for Harold Wilson's community development projects. I then, in 1973, was one of the leaders of the occupation of the Triumph motorcycle work in Meriden to form a workers' cooperative, which we did, and it was successful. Between 1976 and 79, I was Under Secretary of State for Industry in Jim Callaghan's government, and we introduced the Industrial Common Ownership Act and the 1978 Cooperative Development Agency Act. Those actually formed the backbone of a lot of the doubling of the cooperative sector that we did in the 1970s and 1980s. As I keep saying to John, I'm very grateful that I was a member of his implementation group for doubling the size of the co-ops, but we've actually done it before, and that was the basis of the legislation. In 1980, when I was a member of the Labour Party National Executive Committee, I chaired a working party which produced some recommendations on worker co-ops. You won't see the book here because of the screen share, but this is the report that we produced in 1980. That then became part of the 1983 manifesto. Unfortunately, as John said, we lost the election, so we couldn't carry a lot of that out. Very, very fast forward to John's implementation group in 2018 and 2019. That led to the insertion in the 2019 manifesto of the part about doubling co-ops. So if I may say so, with about 40 years in between, I contributed to both the 1983 and the 2019 election manifesto. So enough of me, but I would hope that, if I may say so, that gives me a tiny bit of legitimacy to say some of the things that I've tried to say in the book. Okay, a bit of background, and again, I'm going to skim through this very rapidly because I've still got a lot of slides to get through, and Owen will show me the red card if I don't stick to time. You will see from that there is an extensive period of social enterprise development in the 1980s. I have to say that in many mainstream academic contributions, you rarely find much acknowledgement of that period. It was kicked off by Freya Spreckley, who is here tonight, in Beechwood College in 1978. Charlie Cattell, who's also here tonight. Charlie did a lot of the registrations of what were then co-ops, although they were companies limited by guarantee, throughout the 1980s. We had that big report produced by the Community Ventures Business Unit in 1981, which wrote in a great amount of detail about local community organizations. And we then had a number of other initiatives, which I'll refer to. And by 1991, Martin Metillard was already writing in various journals about what he called social enterprises. So I have to say, for those who think that social enterprise is in some way a new Labour invention, that isn't the case at all. There was a lot of social enterprise and a lot of cooperative activity on the ground throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Again, I'm going to fast forward and skip over the beginnings of the new Labour period because I want to discuss that a bit later in my slides. To try and get almost up to date, by 2019, we had a KIVO, which represents, or brought together a task force rather, representing the main social enterprise infrastructure organizations. And they, even by 2019, had accepted what I'll describe a bit later as a marketized social enterprise sector. Again, fast forward with the social investment task force report and various other things, we get to the stage where fortunately John and Jeremy start to take policy initiatives, and that's where the booklet that John referred to tonight, you won't see it again because of the screen share, Alternative Models of Ownership, which I was obviously a very proud contributor, So you will see that by 2017, the Labour Party, particularly under John and Jeremy, are starting to develop alternative proposals. John sets up his implementation group, and as I say, we got the doubling the cooperative sector in the 2019 manifesto. The latest development, which I'll try and talk about a bit later, is that Co-ops UK has joined up with the Employee Ownership Association. I have to say I'm not overly impressed by that, but hopefully we can talk about that a bit later. Let me get into the meat though, if I may. I want to stress that although I have some quite severe differences with a lot of other mainstream academic interpretations of what social enterprise and cooperatives are all about, I'm not seeking to pick a fight. That really isn't my intent. All I'm seeking to do in the book, and certainly what I'm hoping to relate to you tonight, is what I saw, because I was there. And if I may say so, people like Charlie Cattell was there as well. So there's a number of us on the set tonight who went through the same period. I think my worry is that in many ways academia and higher education has got a bit too involved in the process, so that although academia recognises a new Labour period when there were only mainly marketised social enterprises, it's unfortunately the case that in many cases it strikes me that some in academia have got a bit too close to that process, with the result that either knowingly or unknowingly they neglect all of the precedents that I've just described from the 1970s and 1980s. But the other problem that I have is that most of the mainstream UK academic contributions really either don't seem to relate or don't seem to know about some very, very relevant alternative proposals for alternative local social economies that were happening at the same time as New Labour in Quebec, in France and elsewhere, and of those you rarely find a mention in UK academic contributions. Of what I'm saying to you, it could have been different. It could have been different if a fair number of academic contributions, if I may say so, had removed their New Labour metaverse goggles, looked across the channel and looked to Quebec. But I'll talk about those in just a few minutes. If you go back to the essential period, which is where I think it all began, and I'm glad that Freya Spreckley is with us tonight, in 1981 from Beechwood College, Freya and Jim Brown, who's also with us tonight, produced a booklet, a pamphlet called Social Audit, a Management Tool for Cooperative Working. I have to say that to many of us, that's a far more meaningful and wide-reaching manifesto for social enterprise than anything that was produced by Charlie Ledbetter and Demos and some of the other contributions in the 1990s. So for me, it was Freya Spreckley, it was Beechwood College, it was the Social Audit Manual that provided the, if you like, theoretical underpinning, together with the two 1976 and 1978 Labour Government Acts, that provided the underpinning. And as I say, Charlie Cattell did most of the registrations. If we fast forward to 1997, then I have to say we get a very different interpretation of social enterprise. It's already being prepared for the market. It doesn't seem to recognise any kind of antecedents in the 1970s and 1980s. It borrows a bit from l'Emergence des Entreprises Sociales, the EMES network on the continent, but that's the only bit that it borrows from mainland Europe. It also borrows from new non-profit interpretations in the United States, which are mainly based on a marketized economy. So I have to say, I have great difficulty in recognizing the sort of New Labour demos interpretation. It's a marketized interpretation, but apart from that, it completely neglects the historical antecedents, and I can't understand why that's the case. Let me just come down to the main point that I'm trying to make. If you keep your New Labour metaverse goggles on, then I suppose if you really do think that social enterprise didn't start until Charlie Ledbetter in 1997, you have to be very careful how you explain things. Because first of all, it wasn't a seamless transfer from cooperatives to social enterprises. It was a heck of a political battle. But of course, the reason that that political battle took place is that because Blair and New Labour and Patricia Hewitt wanted to get social enterprises and third sector organisations into the downsizing and cheap delivery of public services, because what they wanted to do was to outsource more public service delivery to what they thought were lower cost social enterprises. But to do all of that, you can't do all of that when you've got co-ops, and you can't do all of that when you've got local co-op democracy. And that's why, as I'm going to show in the next 2 or 3 slides, there was a fairly significant jettisoning, not just of co-op activity, but co-op sounding activity. I'll go through that in just a few minutes. That also means, by the way, that if you keep your New Labour goggles on, you're going to miss out the sort of paradigm shift that took place from those community-controlled local community defence organisations, because that's what many of them were. You're going to miss out that transformation from those organisations to the marketised variant of social enterprise that we have today. So, you know, the New Labour interpretation obviously is that the previous historical antecedents weren't there, but that to me takes a bit of explaining, because you still have to explain why there was a big shift from cooperatives in 1998 to social enterprises by 2002 and 2003. It also means that the mainstream academic interpretation completely misses out on the deliberate marketisation of the third sector that took place between 2002 and 2004. I won't go through all of the pieces of legislation which I've listed there, because I will deal with those later. But there's a whole lot of analysis that if you keep your New Labour goggles on, if I may say so, you miss out. But the main thing that you miss out is that because the organisations in the 1970s and 1980s were co-ops, okay, they were registered as companies limited by guarantee, but they were democratically controlled, they were based in their local communities, and if I may say so, increasingly that's what social enterprises in future will not be. So that's the big change in what's happening, but if I may say so, if you only view it through the New Labour prism, you won't see that that change has taken place. Okay, let me just go back very, very briefly then to the 1980s stuff. If you want a good, accurate description, I suppose my standard reference work of the 1980s organisations that I've been trying to describe was done by the Community Ventures Business Unit. That's Penny Gostin, Sandra Hudson, Rodney Stairs, who's here with us tonight, and Colin Ball, who did a lot of work with the European Union. And they describe those 1980s community-based social enterprise organizations in detail in that contribution. But the other thing, if you still doubt some of the things that I'm saying, just have a brief rehearsal of the organizations that I've listed there tonight, and there's many more of them. I got those from the IDOCS group, which took over all of the planning exchange documents. Most of those organizations in the 1970s and 1980s, which I've listed there, they were funded with the same kind of mixture of funding that social enterprises get their funding from today. And I've listed there the Kalusko-Benkin Foundation, German Marshall Fund, Barrow Cadbury, MSc programs, the Urban Program as well, European Social Fund, and the private sector. So a lot of those organizations which are described in Whose Business is Business got their funding from the same mix of sources that social enterprises do today. But if you really find difficulty in accepting the interpretation that I'm giving tonight, namely that social enterprise has some very important historical antecedents, if you really find difficulty with that, then I can only produce for you the quote with Charlie Cattell, and Charlie's on the call tonight, so I hope Owen, you might possibly call him. But Charlie did all of the registrations for ICOM, the industrial common ownership movement in the 1970s and 1980s. He is still a consultant, so he is still doing the registrations. And you can read for yourself what Charlie is saying. First of all, they were companies limited by guarantee, the majority of them. The majority of social enterprise registrations today are also companies limited by guarantee. So what Charlie is saying, and he was the one that's been doing registrations for the past 40 years, so he ought to know. So that's Charlie saying there really isn't a difference between those historical antecedents that quite a few people seem not to notice or prefer to forget, and the majority of social enterprises today. Okay, this is the bit that I have. This is the bit that I have the great difficulty with, and I've got to name a few names, although I'm not seeking to pick a fight. Alex Nichols and one or two others who've been obviously writing about social enterprises in academic contributions more than I have. Alex and others really do seem to think that it didn't start, social enterprise didn't start until the 1990s. And he refers to the Community Action Network, the Social Enterprise Coalition, which was 2002, and key paradigm building actors have more legitimacy than the field itself. I really do find that quite difficult. Anybody who reads the basic documents, and maybe I've done a bit more research than one or two others, and I've been very lucky with the information that I've been given, will see that the key paradigm actors weren't in the 1990s, but they were throughout the 1970s and 1980s, trained in many cases by Beechwood, promoted and supported and funded by local co-op development agencies. So to start talking about key paradigm building actors as late as the 1990s, I really do find quite difficult. Sad to say, and I've got to give a couple more names, Paolo Grenier and Andrea Westall, and Andrea was very prominent when the social enterprise unit was launched in the Department of Trade and Industry. So if I may say so, Andrea and Paolo ought to know the period very well. But again, they keep writing about this 1990 period as though social enterprise had only just been invented. I have to say that without going into all the details here, I really do find that interpretation difficult. As I say, maybe it's because if you keep your new Labour, thanks to Mark Zuckerberg, metaverse goggles on, maybe that's the way that you see the world. But the other problem that I have, you see, is that if you only think that social enterprise is a comparatively recent development, then how is it that you, if I may say so, almost conveniently ignore all of the alternatives that were taking place at the same time as New Labour's introduction, if I can use the phrase, of social enterprise? There had been a social economy framework in France since 1977. The publishers of the Annals of Public and Cooperative Economics, that's Syriac made approaches to UK academics and said, will you join in our discussions? So it wasn't as if UK academics were ignorant about social economy developments that were taking place elsewhere. They were actually invited to take part in those discussions. And as Yvonne Gellard says, in her 50 years of Syriac, they didn't really get a UK response. But to me, and I'm glad that the slide has tripped in advance, my PowerPoint is getting a bit excited. The real thing that I find great difficulty in not being able to understand is that in 1998, Martine Aubry, and if I may say so, as the daughter of Jacques Delors, and since she was almost the left candidate for the presidency in 2012 against François Hollande, you would think that Martine Aubry, as the Minister for Economy and Solidarity in 1998, was a fairly significant character. And she approached Alain Lipitz, who was at that time a Green MEP, and said to Alain, I want you to produce a very detailed report on what a social economy might look like. Alan produced a very, very detailed report, delivered it to Martine Aubry. Unfortunately, she was defeated in 2002 and couldn't implement this. Now, let me just say this candidly to you. I used to sit next to Léonard Jospin, who was the Prime Minister at the time of Martine Aubry in the European Parliament, very significant figure. Martine Aubry was a very significant figure. Alain Lipitz produced a very significant report. All of this happened at exactly the same time as social enterprise London and social enterprise policies were being developed in the UK. I have never seen in any UK academic contribution any mention of Alan Lepete's report. I have to say something is very sadly missing. Alan was a member of the European Parliament, and as a member of the European Parliament, anything that he said or produced would have been translated into English. So if I may say so, it wasn't particularly difficult to find out what Alain and Martine Aubry were trying to do in France to create an alternative local social economy at the same time. Just as significant as that were some of the things that were happening in Quebec. And it particularly galls me is to think that the women's movement in Quebec in 1995, they effectively generated the chantier, the framework for an alternative social economy in Quebec. All of this was taking place at exactly the same time as Social Enterprise London and the kind of paradigm building actors that Alex Nichols and co are talking about, which you will rarely find a mention of the development of the chantier in Quebec alongside what was happening in Social Enterprise London. So I still can't understand, first of all, why it's necessary to reinvent social enterprise in the 1990s after there were all those social enterprises on the ground in the 1970s and 1980s. Least of all can I understand why so many mainstream academic UK contributions focus on Social Enterprise London, focus on the things that in the UK, but either don't know about or don't write about the alternative social economy developments in the places that I've just referred to. The only thing that has been picked up in a lot of mainstream UK academic contributions is the interpretation of work integration social enterprises, WISEs. And that was particularly promoted by l'Emergence des Entreprises Sociales, the EMES network from the University of Louvain, and in Brussels and elsewhere. But the problem is that all of that is based on the French revenue minimum d'insertion scheme, which was introduced in 1998. And what that RMI scheme said is that if you want to get a placement and if you want to draw wages while you're on a placement, you have to be trained and you have to be partly employed by one of these new social enterprises. In other words, it seems to me that the main borrowing of UK academic contributions, they've borrowed from the EMAS RMI scheme, which is obviously tailored to a particular framework in France and in other places in mainstream Europe, but it won't work in the UK. And the reason that it won't work properly in the UK, I can tell you from funding experience, is that running wage subsidy work placement schemes are expensive. They're expensive because you've got to pay the people in the job that they have. I tried to do it with the European Social Fund, but they used to keep telling me, Les, it's too expensive. So I have to say, I'm still utterly perplexed about so many mainstream UK academic interpretations who either don't want to know about the past or don't seem to know about things that they could have borrowed from, or they could have noticed, or they could have written about in other places at the same time. Now, let me just fast forward again, because it's not only a case of missing some of the things that were happening elsewhere. It's also, if I may say so, a matter of missing things that were developing even in the UK. I've said that one of the main reasons that Blair and Patricia Hewitt and the new Labour government wanted to jettison cooperatives is that you couldn't do all that they sought to do with social enterprises if you had too much local cooperative democracy and local accountability. The best example to me is Social Enterprise London. And Social Enterprise London was first registered in February and March 1998. It was registered, by the way, it was registered jointly by the London Industrial Common Ownership Movement and London Cooperative Training. In other words, the people who set up Social Enterprise London And the people who started Social Enterprise London, when it was first registered in 1998, they were all cooperators, all cooperators. But in the first annual general meeting in October 1998, you will find that only 18 people attending, which, if I may say so, is quite a political masterpiece anyway, but pretty well all reference to cooperatives by that time had disappeared. If you go to the following annual general meeting, the second annual general meeting of Social Enterprise London, and we're only talking effectively about 18 months after the new coordinator, the new director, Jonathan Bland, took over, you'll find that by 1999, there was hardly a mention of cooperatives. And I've seen all the minutes, by the way, so it's not just me saying that, I'm getting it from the minutes. You may say, well, Les, you've been in politics a long time. How is that possible? I'll tell you quite simply that the people in Social Enterprise London and Jonathan Bland were told, either indirectly or directly, social enterprise is where the money is. So this really is a case of Social Enterprise London following the money. So if you don't believe that there was a jettisoning of co-ops and local economic democracy, Social Enterprise London following the money is a very good example of that. An even more dramatic example of all that I'm trying to say to you is the almost deliberate exclusion of cooperatives from the first definition that the Department of Trade and Industry made in July 2002 in its Strategy for Success document. Had it not been for some pretty frantic lobbying by Pauline Green, who'd been a member of the European Parliament and leader of the Socialist group in the European Parliament, what Pauline managed to do in the Strategy for Success document, she managed to get one word, principally, included. And the significance of that is very big. Because don't forget that the original document was talking about no distribution. You couldn't do distribution to members, you couldn't do distribution to outsiders. The trouble is that if that definition had remained in its original form, that would have excluded cooperatives, because of course cooperatives do distribution to their members. And it was Pauline's insertion of that word principally in the July 2002 Strategy for Success DTI initial definition of what a social enterprise is in UK legislation. Pauline saved the day. Now, again, if you have difficulty with that interpretation, Jim Brown, who's on the call tonight, Jim was there at that time. Jim saw it happening. Jim has written about it. And from all of the interviews and all of the data collection that I've done, I obviously very much concur with Jim. If you still have difficulty in accepting what I'm writing about jettisoning and killing the co-ops, if you still find a problem with that, I'm not going to obviously divulge my sources, but this is Tony Blair having a breakfast meeting with the co-op movement. The 22nd of February 2002, and this is Blair being fairly blunt about it, and others in his office being fairly blunt about it, fairly bluntly telling the co-op movement, you are not on. You are not on. And of course, the main reason for that, I keep trying to say to you, is that if you want to transform the third sector, if you particularly want to transform what the third sector is going to do into a marketized variant, you can't have all of this co-op democracy stuff around. So that was Blair being very firm with the co-op movement back in February 2002. But you see, it goes beyond that. John Pierce, I've given his quote at the top, and we all know John and social enterprise in any town. John had spotted what was happening. If you have a look at the Department of Trade and Industry consultation on community interest companies in 2003, quite open about the fact that they want to introduce private money. And that document actually says, and I've given 2 or 3 quotes there, saying that substantial commercial investors may be expected to appoint directors to protect their interests. Now, you can't do that with a co-op. You can't do that, in fact, with a properly constituted social enterprise. But that's what the new Labour government was seeking to do, to marketise the third sector as early as 2003. Very, very quickly, I want to go to the mainstream academic interpretation. Now, again, I don't want to pick a fight with Helen Hoff and Mike Kitson. I don't want to pick a fight with a good friend of mine, Roger Spear, because I'm at the Open University as well. But I simply want to say,
Yes.
I do not...
2 minutes.
Okay. I do not understand how you can say that all of that represents a seamless transfer. To me, that represents a deliberate jettisoning of cooperatives and local social democracy. Owen, I'm going to go straight to the end, and you'll be very pleased about this because I was almost there anyway. The problem that I've got with all of this, apart from the fact that the New Labour goggles version deliberately neglects the previous local democracy and accountability, this is destroying civil society. It's destroying civil society because we know throughout COVID that it's local community-based organisations, in many cases, that have kept local communities going. But you see, the biggest problem politically that I have with all of this is that if you stick to the New Labour PRISM version, then you are able to claim that in some way social enterprise is an alternative to capitalism and neoliberalism. You can claim it's an alternative if you don't look back to that period of what came before. In fact, we've now got to the stage where social enterprise and much of the third sector, and unfortunately increasingly cooperatives as well, are becoming an essential agent of neoliberalism. That's where we've got to. And finally, Owen, I promise this is the final word. Johnny Farley Gordon from Stir to Action said to me, Les, have you got an end of history quote? And he gave me one, and this is why I put Johnny in brackets. What all of this is heading for is, first of all, the disappearance of anything that we might be able to label social enterprise and the third sector. And all we're going to end up with is markets and a few acts of kindness. Now, I think that's pretty desperate stuff, but that's the direction in which we're heading. It's all in the book. Thank you for listening tonight. I'm very grateful. Thanks for your patience. Hopefully we can get some questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for that. So we've got a little bit less long for questions than we might have done, but it's been one I've never in all of the kind of last 18 months on Zoom seen a chat quite like this one during this. Absolutely, just like dozens and dozens of like really detailed kind of engagements and critiques and so on. And I hope someone's cutting, I hope someone is recording all of those or cutting and pasting them somewhere. And some of them I imagine will come out in questions. But there's one I want to kind of, I had a question which actually is kind of a little bit similar to something raised in the chat by Alex Bird. And it's very much one about definitions. One of the real kind of values of this book is that it kind of tries to go into the detail and the definition of something which everybody says they like. Nobody ever says that they think co-ops are bad, or at least they haven't done for a very long time. I'd be quite interested if someone were to do so, actually. I'd read that. But it tends to mean very different things. The social enterprise is discussed by John or Les, or social enterprise discussed by Blair or Patricia Hewitt, or the kind of version of it that David Cameron kind of popularized as Big Society. These all mean fairly different things. And I think one of the important things about this is going like, what is it that we're actually talking about? What is it that we actually want? And within that, a lot of the details that really struck me were from the kind of Demos reports by your kind of people like Jeff Mulgan and Charlie Leadbeater and these sorts of people. And particularly a quote, I think, from Leadbeater about, we want to return to the kind of voluntaristic idea of welfare of the 18th and 19th century. And I was floored by that as someone that had come to the book from, an interest, but not from expertise. If you were kind of looking for examples of societies where, popular welfare was well looked after, 18th or 19th century Britain are not where you'd look. But nonetheless, there was this idea very much that you would sort of go back to something like this, and that could be charity, it could be cooperatives, or it could be this kind of that particular kind of idea of social enterprise. And one of the things I like in the book is going into why they wanted to talk about social enterprise and not about co-ops. And it seems that for some of them took it more seriously, but for some of them, it really was a question of nomenclature. That co-ops suggested old labour movement, the divvy, the co-op, or it's just a kind of housing co-ops and activism, whereas social enterprise sounded New Labour and capitalist and sexy and interesting, particularly because I had the word enterprise in. It's just that what you were doing was something entrepreneurial and something that was market-based. And Alex Bird's point is very much like, well, places like kind of Quebec, they don't tend to talk about social enterprise, they would talk about social economy. And so my question, and after that, we'll go to other people's questions. My question would be, why talk about enterprise at all? If we're kind of picking apart all of these definitions, why would we want something that's social enterprise rather than, a social economy, or to talk solely about cooperatives? What is it in that phrase that's important?
Did you want a response to that, Owen?
Yes, that's what we're doing now.
I'm very grateful because I don't want to take up all the time. This, I suppose, is a debate which is obviously, hopefully, going to extend beyond my book and extend beyond tonight. And hopefully we're going to have a lot more of these discussions. And I've already started to set up alternative discussion platforms. If you have a look at the 1970s, 1980s stuff, yes, most of those organizations were businesses. Most of those organizations were businesses because by definition, as companies limited by guarantee, instead of charities, that's what they were. But there were also other organizations as well, which because of grants from various places, just about got by. But the difficulty is that because after the DTI Strategy for Success document, the DTI Strategy for Success document really sets the pace when it says that it doesn't matter what you are, you're a business. You're a business. And unfortunately, most of the New Labour stuff, the emphasis of most of the New Labour stuff from then on says you're a business. So I suppose my shorthand answer is that because there was a recognition in the 1970s and 1980s that a lot of the organisations that we've been talking about tonight will have to be grant aided, the increasing emphasis in New Labour period is do away with the grants. You can have equity stakes. You can have impact investment from external investors. So that's the big difference. There was a recognition in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, particularly in that GLC period, that most of this had to be grant aided. There had to be some grants because it couldn't stand on its own 2 feet. Most of that is almost disappearing now. Unless you're an enterprise, unless you can stand on your own 2 feet, you're not going to last very long. That's the big difference.
Yeah. Okay, so we're doing this via people raising their hand, and I've not done this before, but I'm going to go through, and you have to press the hand button, and I will hopefully spot you. And you've all been at it in the chat, so come on, out with it. I don't see.
Hand will just appear in the top left-hand corner of the screen, Owen.
Okay. Sorry, have I missed one?
Yeah. Is it Sean?
Go for it.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, hi. Thank you very much, Owen and Kim. Hello, my name's Sean Wellens. I was a young worker cooperator in London in the period that of the book. I've been working in a primary worker cooperative in the printing industry for a very long time, and nowadays I'm a worker cooperative organiser mainly in London, and I've been doing the Charlie Cattell job of registering lots of new worker co-ops, particularly in tech industry, software. So we're not dead. Many of our co-ops do go back to that era. Les's book is incredibly important for us trying to navigate a way for our movement forward, because it's about time somebody wrote a proper history, and I'm looking forward to reading it hugely. One thing I'd like to echo is that one of my roles is I represent the UK's worker and social cooperatives at European level at CCOP, the European network of cooperatives in industry and services. And I'm continually struck by something that Les points to really clearly, which is how far the UK narrative around social enterprise and cooperativism has diverged from the rest of Europe, but also diverged from the North American, the Americas, and even from the Asian narrative about what this is about. It's quite striking. but looking forward to the future, you know, our ICOM dissolved in 2000, and our worker co-ops amalgamated with the consumer co-ops in Cooperatives UK, and that's where we've been sheltering for the last 20 years. My question to Les is that if ICOM, the Industrial Common Ownership Movement, perhaps under a different name, were to relaunch next year, and that may or may not be a theoretical question, what should its manifesto be, and who should it include in an effort to create a new coalition of people coming together under the banner of common ownership of productive resources, other than the few hundred worker co-ops that actually exist in the UK at the moment? So let's imagine that we're going back, we're learning from history, we're going to do what John McDonnell talks about, which is open up the intellectual debate and create excitement around a new movement, because it's definitely there. Since 2009, there's a whole generation of people for whom this is old history. You know, a 29-year-old friend of mine found out about ICOM recently and was so excited she wrote a Wikipedia entry about ICOM because nobody had done it. So there's real interest, particularly in industries like tech, the movement for the movement, Tech for Good movement, in democratic ownership and control of resources, the battle over the internet, which is the new technology. So yeah, so the question is, what would a new ICOM be putting out there, and who would the new ICOM be bringing in as grassroots, in terms of grassroots organisations? Thank you.
Owen, I promise I'll be brief. This morning I attended the 3rd National Social Enterprise Conference in Dublin. Obviously it was online, and I'm very pleased to say that John Ryan from the Irish Department of Rural and Community Affairs is with us tonight. Thank you, John. But you see, the language that was being used this morning in the Dublin online session, 360 people attending, by the way, online, completely different language, Sean. It wasn't about some of the stuff that you'll find from New Labour, but they still talk about social enterprises as, if I may say so, both of us used to know them in the 1980s and 1990s. Let me come straight on to your question. If the industrial common ownership movement, because that's what ICOM is, and the industrial common ownership finance were to be revived, first of all, they ought to find better ways of including the fastest growing sectors of the cooperative movement. I'm talking obviously about worker co-ops, but I'm equally talking about community energy co-ops. I'm talking about community benefit societies. They all have similar registrations, but unfortunately, if I may say so, Co-ops UK doesn't seem to enclose them very easily. The Co-op Party finds it even more difficult to enclose them. It's exactly the same battle, if you like, which we had in the 1980s. As you know, a lot of us were pushing to get worker co-ops affiliated to the Co-op Party, but that didn't happen. We got the same battle now in that the fastest growing parts of the cooperative movement don't really have any allegiance to any of the institutional arrangements for the co-ops. So that's the first thing that I would say, Sean. If it's going to be a new ICOM, and I personally would welcome that, it's got to encompass all sections of particularly the fastest growing parts of the cooperative movement. But let me just go back to the central question. ICOM, as you know, was based on common ownership. It was based on common ownership, which means local democracy. So all of the organizations that I would like to see ICOM encompassing and funding, they also ought to be based on local common ownership. It's unfortunately the case that a lot of the stuff which is pressed in terms of doubling the cooperative sector is top-down stuff. It's almost like you will become a co-op. That's not the approach at all that I would like to see a new ICOM favouring. So I suppose what it comes down to, common ownership, local social democracy, obviously funding those kinds of organisations as well, but above all recognising, to put it ever so bluntly, that the co-op movement isn't just the shops. It isn't just a few co-ops funded by local authorities. It's much wider than that. And unless we embrace all parts of the co-op movement, it's not going to survive.
Thanks. So the chat is just still going. Like, if you've got a question, ask a question. But who does have a question is John, so ask it.
Is that me, Owen?
Yep.
I just wanted to come back on the point that you made with regard to New Labour, and was it just a change of language? I think what New Labour was all about with the arrival, when John Smith died and Blair took over, was elected, there was a conscious, I think you're right, exercise to reject all that went on before and rebrand. But that led to something different. There'll be people on this chat now that who went through this as well. I was involved as a rank of our Labour Party member, someone with local government experience, a bureaucrat in local government, etc. I was involved, like many here, on all those different working groups in the 1990s that were developing Labour policy. And in those days, there was a whole mass of different groups, and they were populated by Labour Party members and trade union members discussing ideas, housing, you name it, right the way across the piece. After John Smith's death, what then happened is suddenly, instead of it being Labour Party members, suddenly we were having around the table people representing the big accountancy firms. In fact, some of the meetings were taking place at KPMG and elsewhere. And that's how, and then all of a sudden other ideas were being laid on the table, like PFIs, public-private partnerships, all of these sort of things. And what was happening is that some elements of capital had seen that the Tories had run their course, Labour was coming in. This was the opportunity to shape the policies and even the manifesto of that incoming Labour government. And so therefore, it wasn't just a rebranding. That might have been the political meaning of what Tony Blair was about, because I think he was ideological vacant. But then I think throughout that period of the transformation of policy, I think it was significantly influenced by some of those that saw the opportunity of a Labour government. And I think that impacted upon every area of policy, including that redefinition of what we thought was the cooperative movement or social enterprise. Final point from me as well, where I think Sean spoke about where do we go from the future. I just think there's a bubbling up now, almost unreported, of a new generation that is looking at the cooperative model in virtually every sector. Sean mentioned the tech sector, but it's also hospitality, it's around housing, it's around platform co-ops in the tech sector, of course. Energy has been mentioned, but also the development of community land trusts, cooperatively managed, etc. So there's a bubbling up of a massive range of new ideas. And I think what we've got to try and do is try and assist and participate in that movement, so that actually there's an understanding of the point that Les has made of the antecedents of the cooperative movement and the principles of that, which is about local democracy, and in particular when it comes down to worker control. But if you look at virtually every sector of our economy now, you'll find someone working on a cooperative model of some sort, and that's what's so exciting about this. But it's trying to convince those who will eventually be drafting up the Labour manifesto that this is something that they need to take advantage of as well.
Thanks. I'm going to take two more before going back to Les, so everyone has a bit of time. So I'll take those two and then pass it on back to Les. So first to put their hand up was Tor Justad, so go ahead.
Hello, good evening, and thanks very much. I'm speaking to you from the Highlands of Scotland, and as you can see, we've actually got Wi-Fi up here as well as in London, I'm pleased to say. And yes, I've been involved with what I would call the social economy, l'économie sociale, as Les would be familiar with, for many, many years. And Scotland actually led the way in many ways, certainly in the 70s, with community co-ops, cohomans in Gaelic, that were established throughout the Highlands and Islands. And this idea came from the Gaeltacht area of the west coast of Ireland and was adopted in Scotland, supported by the Highlands and Islands Development Board and Labour government in some periods. We were also pioneers in the community business sector. Many countries came to see what we were doing in Scotland. And in more recent times, community energy, community land ownership has become a big issue in Scotland. So all of these things were pioneered in Scotland. So I noticed somebody had Wales up, what was happening in Wales. So just so we don't get too focused on London, although having been born there, I have some connection with London, but haven't lived there since I was 6 weeks old. So anyway, that's my contribution, just to put Scotland on the map and make sure that in any record of the co-op movement and the more modern version of co-ops, that Scotland is clearly on the record. Thank you.
Thanks, Tor. We have also a question from Ian Hewitt, so the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. I hope you can hear me. I've been at the Platform Co-op conference virtually over the past few days, and there is a lot of energy and excitement. But I'd like to ask, why is your book so necessary, Les? Why has it remained hidden in the long grass for so long? And have the worthies within the co-op movement kept their New Labour prism lenses on for too long? Because the language over the past few years has been, within the co-op movement, has been of that ilk. I first got involved in a local regeneration scheme, which went off the rails and was very much tied to New Labour. And I attended a Society of Co-op Studies where Ian McPherson set out the new values and principles statement and took that back to our rickety regeneration group and was told that there was freedom and democracy and communism, and we weren't going to consider cooperative values and principles. So we've obviously got a lot to learn, and I think even the platform co-op groups have got a lot to learn in terms of the history and the politics and the important details that hold co-ops together. But thanks for your book, Les.
Can I just, I'm not going to take up too much time, Owen, because you'll tell me off.
You've got plenty of time, actually.
Okay,
I don't see any others going up, so you've got...
You see, what Tor has said about the Highlands is very interesting, because Highlands and Islands Enterprise, or HI as we call it, has always had a community development brief. That's not the case with Scottish Enterprise in the main part of Scotland. So Tor's absolutely right. I mean, there was a lot of support from Highlands and Islands Council, but also from Highlands and Islands Enterprise for exactly the kind of thing that we're talking about tonight. And he's absolutely right. That, coupled with community land ownership and getting rid of the landowners, and a lot of us don't forget the clearances. There's a lot of history there, and I think that that's been built on quite nicely. And I'm very, very glad that Tor has mentioned that tonight. What Ian is saying, you see, is quite interesting. Why is a book like mine necessary? I'll be ever so blunt, Ian. I am still very, very perplexed how those writing academically and in other ways can write about social enterprise as they do without remembering or even referring to the stuff that came before. Because the stuff that came before was essentially local, it was democratic, it was an alternative sort of economy, and that's the kind of thing that you're talking about with platform co-ops. So all of those local social economy structures either seem to have been forgotten, or, as I say, a lot of people who seem to believe that in some way social enterprise is an alternative to capitalism don't want to remember that previous period. But if I can just go back to why is this necessary, I'm still perplexed. I've been through all the social enterprise minutes that I could get hold of. I've obviously had access to a lot of documents that, I've been very lucky, I've been very fortunate. But it's only through the sort of digging, Ian, and talking to a lot of people who were around at the time, if I may say so, that I've been able to put the book together. Now, if I may say so, that's not particularly clever. I've been given a lot of help by some very good colleagues, but to be very, very candid with you, others could have done it equally as well, and I'm surprised, quite honestly, that they haven't done it before me.
Thanks for that. So there's still all going in the chat, and why people have decided to kind of, it's sort of like having a kind of, having a conversation in the pub, and you can kind of overhear an argument in the corner of the pub that's just raging, and you kind of like slightly kind of like listening into that to that.
Can I just say one thing, by the way? Kim is going to take a file of the chat. Kim, in addition to sending out the presentation, because I would love you to see the end of the presentation, chuckle, chuckle, I would love you to see the end of the presentation, and I hope it does stimulate a lot more discussion. But I would, Owen, you're quite right, I'd like people to have a look at the chat in retrospect as well, because although we all take part in many, many online things, you're absolutely right. I have never seen a chat as lively as ours tonight.
But we do have an actual question from Richard Bickle, so go ahead.
Hiya. It's a couple of points in the question. So the couple of points. The first one is, we see this debate through a co-op lens. I think, everybody I feel like this call is a who's who of my 27 years in the movement, to be honest. But I think there's something missing from the discourse about the interaction with the voluntary sector, because I think you could argue that there was a battle for control of the inverted commas social enterprise movement and emerging ideas around social enterprise in the 90s between co-operators, voluntary sector kind of charity people, and some of the more sort of ideologically vacuous corporate interests. And I think a linked point is the distinction in the discourse between social enterprise and social entrepreneurship. And that social entrepreneurship language, when I did some work on it about 15 years ago, I traced to some US papers, I think in the 1970s. But the ideas about how does social change happen? Is it groups of people from the bottom up from which leadership emerges? Or is it the heroic individual from the top down, the kind of white savior, if you like, who comes in and fixes everything and expects everyone to be grateful? And I think one of the consequences of the rise of a neoliberal worldview has been the championing of the heroic individual narrative as against the grassroots group of people. And I mean, we see this in the contemporary consumer co-op movement, in the way that the co-op group are spending enormous amounts of money on employing incredibly part-time member pioneers who are supposed to be heroic individuals on about 4 hours a week in their neighbourhood, without realising that actually the power of cooperation is about harnessing groups of people working together to change the world. So I just wondered, have you looked at the kind of voluntary sector angle, the battles within the voluntary sector between the kind of more liberationist parts of the sector and what you might call the Acevo tendency, these sorts of hugely ambitious, very highly paid voluntary sector chief execs who I think were very keen to get into bed with New Labour to deliver public services on big contracts on the cheap, and to be honest, quite often not very well.
Thanks. There's one more question from Barbara Phillips, and I think we'll take that, and then I'll leave Les to wrap up as much as he can. So, Barbara.
Right. What I'm hearing is what I heard back in the time when I worked at DI, is the cooperative movement falling out amongst itself cannot decide. And I think if we had a unified and constructive approach, things might have been different. But I also want to pick up on Richard Bickle's and John Good's point. They seem to think it's kind of amusing that there was some resistance to including people like John Lewis and Waitrose in the definition of social enterprise. But actually, at a purely common sense level, had they been included, I think we'd have lost much credibility with the public to say that Peter Jones in Sloane Square was somehow equivalent to the sort of amazing dynamic work that people like the School of Social Entrepreneurship were doing. So, you know, I kind of think, why can't we be more open and embracing and less falling out about the niggly bit? And I just wish that today it had been a more positive contribution from the cooperative movement. Thank you.
Okay. If it's me again, Owen, please. What Barbara has said is actually quite important, except that, Barbara, not a lot of us would recognise John Lewis as a co-op. If you have a look at the store closures, if you have a look at what's happening in Waitrose and other places, I have to say there really hasn't been much worker involvement in that. So although John Lewis is dressed up as a partnership, and sometimes people actually call it a co-op, a lot of us don't think it's a co-op. If you go back to the 7 co-op principles, and that obviously includes local control and accountability and democracy, and there's quite a few variants of that around the world. But for many of us, the 7 principles are key. And if I may say so quite bluntly, I don't see much of the 7 principles in the way that John Lewis operates. So in terms of definition, to me, it has to go back to the 7 principles. I think if I may say so. I can't hear that. I'm sorry, Owen.
Actually, in this case, it sounds like Barbara's connection's
Les,
actually, if you could
agree
put
with you
that in the
absolutely.
chat.
At the time, I was saying, yes, we should include cooperative. Right, okay. I absolutely agree with Les is saying, but at people that were speaking on behalf of the co-op, we're trying to argue that all those sort of co-ops had to be included, and that clearly was a nonsense. There was never any anti-co-op feeling. Things like co-ops that run small village stores were absolutely brilliant and were wonderful examples of dynamic social enterprise in action. But I mean, I don't understand what Richard Brickell and John were thinking. I mean, are they seriously saying that people like the co-op, that like John Lewis and Peter Jones in Sloane Square should have been included in the definition? Because that really does not make sense on any level to me. I'm glad to hear that Les seems.
Right, I'm assuming that because Barbara, I think Barbara's gone mute again. Barbara, you're right in that there's always been a lot of definitional debate. There's always been a lot of definitional debate. But to me, the key thing is that if you wanted to marketize the third sector, you couldn't have all of this democratic stuff all over the place. And don't forget, that's where a lot of these organizations had come from. They were set up, although they were registered as companies limited by guarantee, they were set up as common ownership co-ops. So that was what New Labour, Patricia Hewitt, etc., wanted to get rid of, because she wanted to change their purpose. She wanted to get private money in, and she wanted to get them doing public services on the cheap. So that's why the definitional thing is important. It was the democratic local accountability that New Labour didn't want to get in the way. But to go back to Richard's made a very important point. Richard, if I may say so, what you've just described is in chapter 4 of my book, because you're absolutely right. If you go back to Barry Knight's centrist report in 1993, with his division between the third force and the third force, there were a lot of people in the voluntary sector who wanted to become government subcontractors. There's always been people in the voluntary sector who've only ever seen themselves as government subcontractors, but a lot of a wider base in the voluntary sector have always said, as soon as we do that, we lose our objectives, we lose our values. But that debate took place when the Deakin Commission was held in 1996 and advocated the contract. Unfortunately, it was the Deakin Commission and the contract and the compact that followed that set the pace, unfortunately, for what then became the case in social enterprise as well. In fact, if you have a look in, it's an article that I've referred to by Emma Carmel and Jenny Harlock in 2008. What they actually say is that by 2003, 2004, the voluntary sector and the social enterprise sector had pretty well become synonymous. They were pretty well the same thing, because both of those definitions included within them organizations, and particularly social entrepreneurs, who saw their main role as government subcontractors. So the definitional stuff is important, but you're right. I mean, the same divisions which exist today in the social enterprise sector were certainly, if I may say so, rampant in the 1990s in the voluntary sector as well.
I mean, if Owen will permit me to very briefly come back, I think if you see this as about a way to deliver public services in either in a cheaper way or a more flexible to the community way or whatever, if you have a contract with a voluntary organisation, government can expect the voluntary organisation to do what it's told because it's a contract. Whereas if you contract with a co-op, those pesky members are going to say, well, hang on a minute, we want to do it our way. And that's also a public policy challenge if you see social enterprise as a tool for delivering government policy.
Very briefly, Owen, of course, the key to all of this is procurement. The key to all of this is procurement. And unfortunately, the only way that cooperatives and social enterprises are going to get a contract at the moment is through competition, either through commissioning or through procurement exercises, and they have to compete against the private sector. And unfortunately, the only way that they're likely to gain the contract is cheaper terms and conditions and cheaper wages. So until we do something about the procurement mechanism, we're going to go on having many of the arguments that we've had tonight. I mean, I'm not going to go on. What I will say to colleagues is thank you for being patient. Thank you for listening. Thank you for hopefully understanding a lot of what we've been trying to explore and analyse tonight. I would certainly hope, and I think I can say this on behalf of John and Owen as well, I would hope that this isn't the last of these occasions. Because if I may say so, if there aren't institutional frameworks in the, dare I say, wider cooperative movement, which can activate a platform or be a platform for discussions like this, then maybe John, maybe Owen, we've got to go on having platforms for discussion like this. So let's please have much more wide discussion. We'll send you copies of the PowerPoint, and obviously we'll send you the YouTube of the recording afterwards. But I hope, Kim, we'll also be able to send everybody the chat as well. Because as I say, I have never, I don't think ever, participated in such a lively chat, although obviously because I've been talking a fair amount of the time, I haven't been able to read all of the contributions. So for me, and Owen can do the final farewell, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Les. This has been delightful. I've found it very, very useful and very interesting, and it's gone in all sorts of directions that I haven't necessarily expected. I think anyone who hasn't already should probably download the chat, because there's a whole load of things going on in there still. But yeah, I think there's the fact that it's still ongoing and the fact that people still have much more to say does suggest that we should carry on with this in some manner, and that this should be the first of many discussions. So thanks all of you for coming to the first one. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Terrific.
See you, folks. Thanks, John. Thanks, Owen. Thank you ever so much. Thank you. See you. And thank you to Kim. Thank you to Sarah.